cried quietly. I have some very bad news, my mom said slowly. She paused. You have to come home this weekend. For 24 hours after I talked to her, I tried to think of ways to get out of it. I felt that if I just refused to come home, I could suspend what was happening. I didn't tell anyone. Saying it out loud would make it real. A few hours after I arrived in New York, he was in a hospital in Washington Heights with a room high above the Hudson River. He had an expensive private room with a beautiful view. It was a cold winter that year, and the river was covered with ice floes, shifting and cracking against each other. My mom, my brother, and I spent 10 days in the hospital with him. It was a mutated version of the father I'd known my whole life. I never got to meet him as an old man, but at 57, in his last few weeks of life, I suddenly saw what he might have looked if he lived to 75. His eyelashes and eyebrows went white, then fell out, and he had lost that last hair on his head that he'd been so vain about. My dad had always been exuberant, energetic, hefty, strong, and powerful, but now he was quiet and confused. One day, he woke up from a morphine-induced sleep and asked, "Why are we in Alaska?" I wish I had understood earlier the gravity of the situation. I wish I had. I wish I had realized he was going to die. I left my family in the hospital and walked a few blocks up to Broadway while I cried. Something I had always appreciated about my hometown, something that lets me know I'm still a little bit of a New Yorker at heart, is that you can cry as hard as you want in public and no one will stop you and ask, "What's wrong?" or even make eye contact, really. I felt safe crying on Broadway, but I couldn't cry in front of my family. The months after my dad died took on a surreal quality. I couldn't seem to get over the basic sense of disbelief. Was he really gone? Forever? Even though there was this cloud of dread hanging over me, a kind of sinking depression, I also had to remember the fact that he was dead over and over, as if it were for the first time. Every morning I would wake up, and there was a second or two of feeling sort of okay, until my stomach flipped, and then I remembered. For years after, every time someone would ask about my dad, there was a flash of remembering he was dead again. I decided to do a project where I would write about him every day for a month. Writing about him began to bring him closer into my life. Something began to shift. Before, I felt afraid of burdening people if I brought him up because of the intensity of my sense of loss that scared me. But suddenly, I didn't need to be fake casual when I brought him up. I could really mention him casually. I have released a lot of my grief in the world through the zine. I didn't need a listener in the same way. I found a picture of my dad recently while I was going through a box of old newspapers. The photograph inquired his pitch for a student council position. There are almost no photographs of my dad before he immigrated to the United States at the age 30. It's strange that I didn't know what my dad looked as a young person until I saw his photograph in the newspaper. He was handsome, sweet, and competitive. He looks a bit like me and so much like my brother that it's a bit eerie. Seeing this photo, I understood why my dad's old friends suck up their breath in sharply every time they meet my brother. I would give anything to have my dad back, and yet I barely ever let myself go down that grief spiral anymore. Cheryl Strayed wrote in her advice column, "Dear Sugar, it has been healing to me to accept in a very simple way that my mother's life was 45 years long, and there was nothing beyond that. There was only the exception that there would be my mother at 89, my mother at 63, my mother at 46. Those things don't exist, and they never will." It's strange how healing it felt to hear this, and to say the simple sentence, my dad's life was 57 years long. Finding the newspaper with the photograph was healing in a different way. I felt that since my dad died, I've been searching for all those things he didn't get to teach me. All the pieces in his life that I missed out on before I was born. I didn't get all those 55 years with him. I got 19. But finding that photograph gave me a small access to a piece of who he was long before he moved to New York, before he became a doctor, or came to his powerful sense of self. Just being able to see what he looks like in a small, strange way gave me a little of that lost time. Learning how to live without my father has been a process of learning how to grieve, learning how to feel my love for him and in my sense of loss in a way that honors him and what he gave me. These days, sometimes I love people because they remind me so much of him. So fierce, so loving, so sweet, so brilliant. Each year in July and February, and his birthday and the anniversary of the day he died remind me to check in with my connection with him. I write him letters, I talk to his ghost, and I try to follow my instincts on what I want those days. To be held, to be whispered to be allowed to be silent, to wander alone, or to stand on a high bridge. To read poetry to myself, to sing songs quietly, to be with my dad's best friend Paul, to drive with hours from my mom, to cook dinner, to sing over the stove, and when it's done, feed it to the people I love.